I want you to close your eyes for a second and imagine that you are sitting in a movie theater. Just any old movie theater in your town or city. The lights dim, the opening credits begin to roll, and everyone in the theater goes quiet as they give their undivided attention for what is about to happen on screen. Now, if you were to go back in time and watch a silent film in a theater back in the day, chances are the theater would be anything but silent. Despite what the name suggests, silent films were rarely silent. They were more of a social event. People cheered, booed, and provided live commentary as the action unfolded. Audiences treated going to the movies like a vaudeville show where interaction was expected, because cinema, at that point, still hadn't become cinema in the way that we understand it today. The idea of sitting in silence for 2.5 hours while you marveled at a visual achievement in storytelling would have been a very foreign concept back then. And then, sound arrived.
Blue sky, smiling at me.
Suddenly, movies demanded something different from the audience. Attention, silence, presence. And for a very brief time, that shift felt wrong, because the definition of going to the movies had started to change. A few weeks ago, a game called Mixtape released 2 very polarizing reviews. A lot of critics loved it, but if you look at some of the reviews online, you'd think that this group of Australian game developers committed some cardinal sin. I've seen this argument play out before. Every artistic medium eventually reaches a point where people stop arguing about whether something is objectively good and they start arguing about whether something even belongs in that category in the first place. Video games have always had an identity problem. Ask 10 people what a video game is, and most of them will probably describe the same handful of things: jumping on enemies, collecting coins, fighting bosses, shooting bad guys, and some loose concept of winning or beating the game. For decades, games were primarily defined by action, mechanics, obstacles, things that you could fail at. Even now, there's people who only really engage with games through a very specific lens. Competitive shooters, giant RPGs, Souls-like games built around mastery and challenge. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. Some of the greatest games ever made are built entirely around these ideas. But the assumption is almost always the same. A game is something you master and overcome. But over the years, we started seeing changes. Developers began experimenting with the one thing that games could do differently from every other medium: presence. Just the feeling of existing in a very specific place at a very specific time. In 2012, Dear Esther released and asked the question, what if a game didn't need to be about winning? What if a game could function more like a poem or a memory or a conversation? Games like Gone Home, Journey, Firewatch, and What Remains of Edith Finch started valuing atmosphere over action, emotion over mechanics, reflection over technical mastery. We got the term walking simulator, which originated as an insult, a way to dismiss these games that seemed uninterested in the traditional value of the medium. But underneath all the review bombing and the discourse was a much bigger question. What are video games actually supposed to be? And that question matters more than people think, because whenever a medium changes, people don't just lose familiarity with it. Sometimes they feel like they're losing a part of themselves. For a lot of people, games aren't just entertainment, they're community and identity. Entire generations grew up believing that games had to justify themselves through challenge and replayability. The game's value and merit was defined by the amount of time it took you to beat it. Which is why I think short narrative games create such a visceral reaction, because they reject the metric that many players were taught to value. Games like Mixtape aren't asking players to conquer anything. They just ask you to remember, to sit with a feeling, to inhabit a moment for a little while before it disappears again. And for some people, that is meaningful. For others, it feels like the medium itself is starting to fall apart. And this has happened many times before, not just in games. Painters were accused of destroying art when they stopped pursuing realism in favor for the abstract. Punk musicians were mocked because they rejected technical mastery and decorum. Television used to be episodic comfort entertainment. Then shows like Twin Peaks or The Sopranos introduced ambiguity and slower pacing. Even comedians like Andy Kaufman, who confused audiences because comedy is supposed to deliver punchlines and not awkward silences and discomfort. When people fall in love with a medium, they also fall in love with the definition of that medium. And definitions are comfortable. Definitions tell us what belongs and what doesn't. The strange thing about games is that they spent decades trying to be taken seriously as an art form, only to run headfirst into a new problem once they finally got there. Once a medium becomes expressive enough, people start using it for things beyond entertainment. Memory, grief, loneliness, nostalgia, regret, and suddenly the rules become even harder to define. Because if a game can make you feel something profound without asking very much of you mechanically, then what exactly separates it from music or literature or cinema? Maybe nothing at all. Gaming culture was built on participation. Skill mattered, time investment mattered. Knowledge of the game mattered. There was a kind of social currency attached to being good at games. Narrative games shatter that belief. Nobody cares if you're good at Gone Home. You can't optimize grief, and you can't min-max nostalgia or speedrun sincerity. And maybe that's why these games provoke such a disproportionate anger. Not because they're replacing traditional games, because let's face it, clearly they aren't, but they challenge the idea that games need to justify themselves in the first place. Some of the games I remember the most aren't the ones I spent the most money on or the ones that I spent the most amount of time playing. They were the ones that caught me at the right moment in my life, at a time when I needed them the most without ever realizing it. And maybe that's the part of this conversation we keep missing. We treat total runtime like an objective value because it's measurable. 30 hours sounds more substantial than 3. An open world the size of 5 Skyrim sounds more impressive than a small, intimate story that takes 3 hours to complete. But nobody judges music that way. Nobody complains that their favorite album ended too quickly if those 40 minutes you spent listening to them changed you somehow. Art, after all, is subjective. And when something truly connects with you, how long it was, how big it was, or how much money was spent making it is totally irrelevant. There's also something else happening here that I don't think a lot of people are talking about, and it's that Mixtape isn't really trying to compete with giant RPGs or competitive multiplayer games in the first place. It's trying to do something much older than that. It's telling a coming-of-age story. And coming-of-age stories have existed in almost every artistic medium for as long as those mediums have existed. Literature had Catcher in the Rye, cinema had Stand By Me and The Breakfast Club. Television had Freaks and Geeks, and music is just filled with albums about youth, nostalgia, and growing older. Stories about friendships, summer nights, first heartbreaks, and the terrifying feeling that your life is going to change forever. And nobody questions whether those stories belong in those mediums. But when games try to tell those same kinds of stories, there's this strange instinct to ask, okay, but where is the gameplay? As if interactivity somehow disqualifies emotional storytelling unless it's wrapped inside combat systems, progression trees, or 50 hours of content. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it entirely. Games can do something other mediums can't. They can make memory interactive. They let you exist inside a moment instead of simply just observing it from the outside. Not every game needs to be a 100-hour epic. Not every game needs to follow in the same footsteps as the ones that came before it. Sometimes a game could just ask you to sit with a feeling for a little bit while you press a few buttons along the way.